Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, great. Broadcasting and going. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thanks so much for joining our live webinar today, which we have titled Positives of Pathogen Positives. Our feature presenter, the Associate Director of Eurofins Microbiology, Dr. Daniel DeMarco, will discuss how you may learn to love a positive pathogen result for all the right reasons, of course. In a minute, I'll hand this over to Dan. First, I wanted to relay a few general notes on the webinar structure for you as you're following along. So we are recording this webinar. After the webinar, slides from the presentation, as well as the recording, will be emailed out to everyone registered within 3 business days. So we'll post that webinar online for on-demand viewing as well. At any point in time during the webinar, you can submit questions you have. You just basically use the little sidebar menu, which you should see on your screen. Select the questions tab, type in your question, and then hit the enter key on your keyboard. We may try and address them as we move through, or of course we can address them after the session, after Dan's done talking, and we can get to all the questions that we have. And of course, if we run out of time, we'll follow up with you afterwards if we don't quite get to your question, or if you have additional questions, you can continue to submit them and we'll make sure to get in a response in on that. That's pretty much it for me. Dan, I'm going to hand this over to you and let you get started on this.
Thanks, Scott. I do appreciate that. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. And so if you have seen any talks by me in the past, or you know me, you know I like to start these things sort of on a lighthearted, kind of a humorous note, just to kind of, relax the audience and more importantly, sort of relax myself. And so today is going to be no different. And as I was thinking about this topic, I started thinking about, how people react to positive results. And typically it's a fairly traumatic experience. And there's a theory out there, it's called stage theory, which is basically a method of categorizing how people recover after a traumatic experience. And basically it says that after a traumatic experience, people go through a series of sort of stages, generalized stages. And at each of those stages, that person needs sort of a specific kind of support to move to the next stage. And as they complete each stage, they can move past their trauma and recover. And many of you may know this from sort of grief recovery from grief. And so there's many variations, but most commonly they have 3, 5, or 7 stages. In recovery following the news of pathogen positive results, it can be particularly difficult. And most scholars in the area, there's only one, that's me, believe there are 5 stages. And this closely aligns with the so-called Kubler-Ross model. So if you look at this model, basically, again, you have the 5 stages. So the first stage is what I call denial. And you hear things like, there must be some mistake, that result can't be correct, the test is broken, it's a false positive for sure. So basically a denialer is saying the positive result did not actually happen, or it's in some sort of an error. And usually this is pretty short, and usually that's replaced by awareness and moving on to stage 2, which is blaming. And here you'll hear things like that, lab cross-contaminated my sample, they have no clue what they're doing. So this person realizes that the denial of the positive result cannot continue. Then they move into the bargaining phase. And in the bargaining phase, there's a little bit of hope usually. If only that person, if you could do something or provide something or give something to replace something, exchange to make the positive result go away. And you'll hear things like, I know, I'll switch testing labs, or better yet, I'll try a different method, or even better, a different method at a different lab. Or you'll hear it was just a PCR positive, probably dead cell detection. It won't confirm by culture, then we will be in the clear. The next stage then becomes depression. And here you really start to understand the certainty of that positive result. And you may shut others out, you might be silent, you might cry a lot. You'll hear things like, it's over, I'm sunk, the feds are going to shut me down for good this time. Goodbye, cushy retirement on a private island. Hello, cold bank cell. And finally, you move into acceptance. Here you come to accept that positive result, and you realize that you can use it to make improvements in your products or processes. And you might hear something like, okay, we had a pathogen positive result. Thank goodness we found it before someone got sick. This means we have a potential process issue or supplier problem. What can we do to fix it? So in terms of the agenda, basically about 5 sections here. So I have a little bit of introductory and background information. I'm going to talk about some of the many good questions of food pathogen testing. I'm not actually going to answer these questions. I'm just going to list them out for you because they're good questions that I think you should be thinking about or asking when contemplating doing food pathogen testing. And then I'm going to have the big question of food pathogen testing, and that's the one I'm going to attempt to answer. And it relates to the purpose of pathogen testing, why we actually do this sort of testing. And I'll talk through some of the consequences if we test for the wrong reasons, some of the consequences, good and bad, if we test for the right reasons. And then I'll close that section with some really important points to remember Then I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the two current approaches to pathogen testing, which are sort of direct testing for the pathogen itself, but also indicator testing. A good chunk of this will be about indicator testing. And I'm going to talk about what I call the Zen of food pathogen testing, which is how do we test for pathogens without testing for pathogens? And they'll talk about some alternatives to traditional indicator testing. And I'll close with a little bit about a molecular method, a new molecular method called EPRI for risk screening. That's a molecular method for indicator testing, and then some conclusions at the end and a summary. So I have to do the obligatory urethans slide. So this is the one I've shown many, many times, and it's interesting. Every time I give a talk, almost I have to update this because the company has grown so much, and even just the 6 years I've been here, and continues to grow wildly. 61,000 plus employees, 900 plus laboratories, and a whole heap of countries, 61 countries, running over 400 million tests a year and over 200,000 different analytical methods. The urethans microbiology laboratory group that I'm a part of is only a small portion of the urethans testing, the urethans business, which is a huge global business that tests in just about every life science category. So we look at the questions that you should be asking or thinking about when contemplating or doing food pathogen testing, and you can say what, all these questions. What pathogens should I be testing for? Here's a list of some. There are more. What technologies should I be using? And there's a ton out there. And I gave a talk about this not too long ago, and it's just an overwhelming array of choices. Lateral flow ELISAs, PCR, qPCR, the list goes on and on. And then you also have what you be doing for confirmation. That's another big part of pathogen testing. You have the screening method, typically for rapid methods at least. Then you have the confirmation portion. Should you be doing culture? Should you be doing culture and biochemical or PCR or molecular confirmation or other approaches? And then what sample should I be testing? You've got environmentals. Could you be testing incoming ingredients? Should you be testing your finished product, or should you be doing all of the above? And then you can ask where. Where should you do your testing? Do you want to do it in-house? Do you want to do it at a third-party lab, or maybe you want to do it in your basement? Should I collect samples for testing? Where should you collect them from? So you have in environmental testing, you have the zones 1 through 4. Or do you want to test somewhere in the production process for finished product? So who should be collecting or shipping my samples? Do you want to have a dedicated production person doing that, or persons? Do you want to have the testing lab, your testing lab, if you use one, doing that? Do you want to have your quality people doing that? Second shift line supervisor. You can choose just about anyone. And then who should be reviewing those results, and who should be responsible for implementing the corrective actions based on those results? Should it be quality? Should it be the regulators? Should it be my testing lab or production, or should it be all of the above? When should you start testing or increase testing? You have basically 3 choices: now, never, or sometime in the future. The same thing for reducing or stopping testing. Can you ever do that? Can you ever reduce? Can you ever stop? And then how do you manage false positives and negatives? Do you let somebody else worry about it? Do you cross your fingers? I hope that's not what you do. And then how do you handle presumptives that do not confirm? If you're using rapid methods, this could happen. And what do you do in that case? Do you retest? Do you treat them as true positives? Do you treat them as negatives? You blame the test, you blame the testing lab. All those things are potential options. But the big question, and the one that I do actually want to answer, is this: why should I test for food pathogens, or why should you test for food pathogens? And basically, another way of saying that is sort of, what is the purpose of food pathogen testing? So, or rather than jumping into answering those questions directly, first I'm going to answer the question of why not. I'm going to give you some excuses that people use that I've heard for not doing pathogen testing. And these are going to come in order, okay? They're going to start with the totally incorrect, not justifiable excuse, to what I'll call the partially correct and somewhat justifiable, but still wrong excuse. Now, you might quibble with my order here, but hopefully you don't quibble with my association of them to the categories. But so from the totally incorrect, not justifiable, you hear things like, my life is complicated enough, I don't need the drama. Obviously not a good excuse, a good reason for not doing food pathogen testing. Testing is too expensive, and positive results are even more expensive. While true that positive results can be expensive, testing costs money. Yes, indeed it does, but consider the alternative. You might hear, well, my food or my commodity, my industry or my competitors, they don't do testing. They don't require testing, pathogen testing, so why should I do it? Or you'll hear this: 99.99% of my samples will be negative anyways, which is in most cases true. Is that a good reason for not doing pathogen testing? Hopefully you'll see that that's not a good reason. He'll hear this: if there's an outbreak or there's a recall and it's linked to my product, I'm going to get fried no matter what. It's going to cost me a fortune, no matter how much or little pathogen testing I do. And those results, those pathogen positive results, are just evidence. They can be used against me, and they will be used against me. And that is at least partially true. But is that a justifiable reason for not doing pathogen testing? And I don't believe that it is. And then you hear this. This is what I consider the most partially correct and most somewhat justifiable, but still wrong answer here. Excuse is, I already do loads of indicator testing, and my quality systems are world-class. Isn't that enough? And I don't believe that it is, actually. Hopefully, maybe you'll see as we get through here why that might be the case. Okay, so now the right answers, okay? So why you should test for food pathogens. Here's 5 what I call right answers, and I'm going to put these in decreasing order of correctness. They're still all I consider to be correct answers. Number 1, this would be, I think, the best reason here. Because I'm a good person, and I believe in the importance of testing for improving food safety and reducing the burden of disease and death from foodborne illness. A very, very ethical and justifiable reason for testing, a good reason. Number 2, I can't eliminate a problem if I don't have one. Absolutely so true. Here's another reason, to validate the effectiveness of process controls and for routine verification that when those validated process controls are used, I'm getting the expected outcome. Because I have to. Customers, regulators demand it. Very true. You do have to, in some cases, do testing for pathogens. And then finally, probably still a correct reason, still a right answer, but probably the least, let's say, the least justifiable, let's say, it was still very much justifiable, because I don't want to go to jail and or see my company go out of business. Okay, so that's the why. So now what about the purpose? Okay, so there's slightly different questions that you're asking. One is why are you doing pathogen testing? And then what is the purpose of pathogen testing? Here I'm only going to give you 3 right answers, again, in decreasing order of correctness. And then I'm going to give you one very wrong one. You'll see these tie back to the whys, basically. So number 1, purpose, to keep the consumer safe and healthy. I mean, that, you can't lose that sight of that. That's why we do pathogen testing. Number 2, to satisfy legal and regulatory requirements. Of course, we have to do testing because it's required of us in many cases. And then, of course, if we don't want to go out of business, and we don't, of course, want to go to jail. Okay, so these are part of the purpose. And then finally, the wrong answer, the absolute wrong purpose here, to produce a constant stream of negative results so I can ship my product without delay or additional hassle or cost. Absolutely not justified, and not the reason that we do pathogen testing, although it seems like sometimes people tend to start to think that, especially as you get negatives after negatives after negatives over time. So now I'm going to talk about some of the consequences of testing for the wrong reason. So if you do test for the wrong reason, these are the kinds of things that can happen. So some of you may remember 2008, the Peanut Corporation of America, this is the peanut butter manufacturer, they distributed peanut butter that was contaminated with salmonella. Okay, there was an outbreak. There were 714 illnesses and actually 9 deaths. There was an initial recall, but buyers of the product, it got expanded. There were all kinds of separate recalls associated with this. They shipped product that had been tested and tested positive for salmonella. And what they did was the positive lots were retested until a negative result was obtained. Okay, the idea of testing until you get a negative result. Okay, absolutely testing for the wrong reasons, with not the right purpose in mind. And of course, as you might expect, when they did an investigation, they found sanitation and pest infestation issues within the facility. And the consequences here were severe and significant. The president of the company, 28 years jail term, 67 felony charges guilty of. VP of sales, 20 years, and the QA manager, 5 years actually in prison for this. Very, very significant and serious consequences for doing the wrong thing here. Here's another example of the consequences. So this is a company, I'm not going to name this company, I'm going to call it Company X. In 2000, it's a little bit more recent, June of 2016 to 2018, routine environmental testing. They found salmonella in the plant 81 times, including 1 positive every month, okay? Employees routinely failed to implement any sort of corrective actions or preventative actions to address these positive salmonella tests. So the company ended up pleading guilty and agreed to pay $19 million in connection with basically unsanitary plant conditions that were linked to an outbreak that occurred because of this. And the company's director of QA until September 2018 pled guilty to 3 federal misdemeanor counts. And I just learned yesterday that he is going to be, or he or she is going to be sentenced, I believe, this month or soon, very soon. So I'm not sure what that's actually going to be, but 3 federal misdemeanor counts. All right,
Hey, Dan,
so now I'm going to talk about, yes.
Dan, sorry to interrupt.
Sure,
Scott here. We had a couple comments about moving a little quick through here.
Sure.
So
Okay.
I know you're really excited on the topic.
We can slow down.
Yeah, not to disrupt your.
Yeah, absolutely. I do tend to do that. And I do tend to do that for sure. I do get very excited. I also do tend to talk quite quickly. So I will try to slow down just a little bit. So I'm going to talk about the right reasons now, or consequences for testing for the right reasons. And as I said at the beginning, there are consequences, both good and bad, even if you are testing for the right reasons. And this is a really good example of that. This is Barry Callebaut. This is a large global manufacturer of chocolate and cocoa products. They discovered Salmonella tendency in routine finished product testing. Okay, so they had a Salmonella positive during their routine product testing, and they actually halted product shipment because of that result. This was eventually traced to a single lot of soy lecithin, and it cost the company $77 million to resolve this issue. Okay, that's not as that is correct. It is $77 million. That is 6 zeros you see there. This was because of all sorts of reasons. There were contractual obligations, there were transportation issues, there were storage issues. They had to do dismantling, cleaning, sanitizing, reselling, all these things they had to do because of this one positive result. And there were actually 4 months of remediation that were required before they could resume full production. Okay, so you might ask yourself the question, it's painful, yes, but nobody got sick, nobody got killed, and nobody went to jail. So is that worth $77 million? So it's an interesting thought. I mean, for me as a person, and I say, of course it's worth it. Any amount of money is worth saving someone's life or preventing an illness. But if you're an actuarial, you're an insurance person, whatever, you're one of these business spreadsheet guys, do you have to put some sort of value on an illness or a life? And is $77 million, is that the right number to put? I don't know. And you look at it compared to the 19 million you saw that it cost company X for doing the wrong thing. So here you're paying, a much greater price for doing the right thing. Now, of course, it's different companies, different sizes, different industries, all those sorts of things come into play. But it's an interesting thought experiment and something interesting to question and think about. So, is it still worth it to test for pathogens? Absolutely, it absolutely is. Is it going to potentially cost you some money? Yes, it potentially could, but it will save. It absolutely will save someone's life. It will save someone from getting sick. In my mind, that definitely makes it worth it. All right, so some important points to remember when you think about the purpose of testing. And this is a quote that I borrowed from a colleague, former colleague, Joel Masso. And she says, testing is a measurement, not a mitigation, which is really, really very, very true and something that's easy to forget. Testing tells us something. It does not control anything, okay? All it does is convey information. It doesn't change anything about that information, it just gives it to us. It doesn't by itself make something safe. So non-detect results are of limited value. So negative results really are very limited in terms of their value. And a lot of this has to do with the sort of the needle in a haystack concept. If you look at, and I presented on this not too long ago, but we did some fancy math. If you look at the concentration of a needle in a haystack, it's actually 170,000 times higher, 5 orders of magnitude higher than the concentration of 1 E. coli in 375 grams of ground beef. Okay, so that tells you how difficult of a problem it is and how low your probability is of actually finding that pathogen. And so you could reasonably argue that a non-detect result is really of no value. So why are we so focused on them? Is a great question. If we do testing effectively, we can make decisions. Okay, and ideally, those decisions are going to be more correct than what we would have made in the absence of testing. Having that result allows us to make correct decisions or more correct decisions than we would have made without that result. You really want to be deliberate about your testing purpose. Are you doing this for surveillance? Is this a risk assessment? Is this some sort of a verification? Or is it an investigation? And do you want to test for the pathogen directly, or do you want to do indicator testing? And coming up, I'll talk a little bit more about both of those things. And really, you want to look at it as a value versus an activity. Do you want to test because of the value it brings, because it makes a positive difference? So that means it's safer or better quality product, or because it's something that you have to do, that one must do. It's just an activity that you have to do to check the box to say you're doing it. And you really want to focus on finding value in the results. And sometimes this is going to require a different approach than what you're used to doing, or even from what other people think or say you should do. All right, so I'm going to talk about, as I said, switch gears a little bit and talk about the 2 approaches, so testing for pathogen directly or indicator testing. And obviously, pathogens can be screened for directly to monitor risk. But the issue here is that pathogens are often at very low prevalence. So you might most tests are not going to find the target. That doesn't mean that it's not there. Again, I just talked about that needle in a haystack concept. Most of these, when you do quantitative methods for direct pathogen testing, which are based on culture or biochemical, can be very slow or rarely done these days. Mostly nowadays, it's rapid and mostly molecular methods, primarily PCR, which are dominating the space. And you get much faster testing, much faster results, but they can still be fairly slow because of the low prevalence of the organisms and thus the requirements for fairly long incubations. And there are, of course, potential implications if pathogen is found. So you may say, let's do indicator testing instead, or in addition to pathogen testing, and most people do. And this basically provides some sort of insight to the overall food safety or quality of a sample or a product or a process. And really, again, it's a way of looking at risk. It's not conclusive of pathogen presence. And some indicators are closely related to a pathogen, mostly closely related, and others are less so, and mostly not correlated. And really, it depends on where one looks. If you look at the literature on indicators, it's sort of all over the place. In some cases, in some industries, for some applications, they work quite well. They seem to correlate very nicely with pathogens. In other cases, not so much. They're primarily quantitative methods. That they're not always that, and they're primarily culture-based methods. They really still dominate. They're generally longer turnaround time than the pathogen test, so they're a little bit slower, and they can be less informative of risk in certain circumstances of pathogen risk. I mean, because that some of them are parts of normal microflora, and they cover sort of broad groups of organisms, and they're mostly used for tracking and trending. So things like sanitation control, assessing the quality of your ingredients or the pathogen risk of those ingredients, and water quality monitoring, that sort of thing. Indicator data is an important point. It's only as useful as the systems in place to ensure the data is actually analyzed and acted upon. I like to tell the story of, as a young scientist, young researcher, or young scientist, I went to a food production facility and spent a half a day with the QA manager there, and he was very happy to tell me all about all this indicator testing they were doing, and all this data they were collecting, and it was really pretty impressive. They were doing tons and tons of indicator testing, collecting tons and tons of data. And I said, okay, well, what happens to the data? What do you do with it? And he pulls out this large 3-ring binder from the shelf. And he says, the data goes in here. And I said, okay, then where does that go? The 3-ring binder? He said, it goes on the shelf right here. So it's not very useful if the data is not used for anything or not looked at by anybody. I'm being a bit facetious here. He did say that the data is actually sent once a month. They send that large 3-ring binder to corporate, and corporate does something with it, which he was not sure what exactly they did. But again, the point is that if you don't use the data, no matter how much data you collect, it's going to be totally useless.
Hey, Dan, before you move on,
sure, go.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
there's
please.
a question that came in. It might be relevant on this last slide. Sure. So someone asked, what concentration for like total aerobic count, yeast and mold, et cetera, might raise a red flag in pathogen testing? I think that kind of relates a little bit to like, can your indicator results help highlight a pathogen issue? Or can you elaborate on that a little bit?
It's hard. It's a hard question. It's really unknown. I mean, you're talking about setting specification limits, basically. What do you set as your spec limit or your release limit? What is good and what is bad in terms of a number? The only way to do that is really to track and trend over time, collect data, get it in a database, and then look at it and say, hey, and also, you're looking at pathogen data maybe at the same time. You're saying, hey, when I see counts above this number, this is unusual, this is way above the mean, this is way above the median, or whatever whatever statistics you want to do to show that something is outside the norm for your particular product or process. Anytime something is outside the norm in micro, that's when you tend to be in an area of higher risk. So really, there's no easy way to set spec limits that I can just say this is the number you want to see, because it really varies so much depending on the product or the process. Hopefully that answers the question.
So, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we look at the sort of traditional pathogen indicator groups, and there's several groups that are used. You have EB, Enterobacteriaceae. You have the generic E. coli, sort of the non-pathogenic E. coli. You have coliforms, you have fecal coliforms, and of course the serious species for L mono testing. And there's others, and there's some other ones. But they all sort of rely on this, what I call the net concept. So some indicator groups cast a wider net than others. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this figure here, it's a good example of this. Here we're talking about testing for the pathogens Salmonella and S-Tex, so the enteric pathogens. And if you look at the net concept, so EB would cast sort of the widest net. The coliforms would be a slightly smaller net. Fecal coliforms then even smaller, and then generic E. coli would be sort of the smallest net there. And you can sort of choose how wide or narrow of a net to cast by the test that you select to use. Okay? And depending on the width or the size of the net that you select to cast, that will determine what pathogens potentially will be captured within that net. So, which brings us to the Zen of food pathogen testing. So this is the idea of what is the sound of one hand clapping. This is what is the idea of testing for pathogens without testing for pathogens. It's sort of what you're doing with indicators, but this is maybe a little bit more targeted. So if you look at the history of test kit development and food pathogen testing, I've been intimately involved in this, we've had two main objectives over the years. Improve sensitivity. This has been the number one mantra. And this is driven by zero tolerance policies. So this is a requirement. You have to detect that single pathogen in a given sample if it's there. And it's also driven by turnaround time. So the more sensitive the method, potentially the faster that method would be. But the second objective, and this is what sort of I want to focus on, is around specificity. And the mantra has been increase specificity. So you only want to detect the specific pathogens of interest. And in many cases, that's the regulated pathogens and nothing else. And the reason for that is simple. The more specific the method is, the fewer false positives you have, the less money, the less costs that are associated with it. But as you saw in the Perry Calibo case, there are still significant financial costs and regulatory consequences can be when pathogens are found. So what would happen is the question if we intentionally made a pathogen test less specific. So we're going against the grain of the traditional thinking in pathogen test kit development, and we take basically a pathogen test kit and we make it intentionally less specific, which we can do. So historically and today, you look at indicator methods, they've been sort of quantitative. Okay, so it's the number, you get a result that says, here's the number of bacteria or yeast and mold, whatever it is, in this volume or weight of sample. Okay, and they've been based on primarily on culture. So you have to grow the organisms up on a plate to count them. And the pathogen methods, in contrast, have really been dominated by the molecular approaches, which are primarily qualitative. So these are presence, absence. They are not quantitative. But the culture-based indicators have limitations, and they have weaknesses in certain circumstances. And we have molecular indicator methods now that can fill some of those gaps. I'm going to talk about one of those just for the next couple slides here. So basically what this is a less or a non-specific pathogen test. Okay, and it's important to understand that this is a risk screening method. Okay, so screening methods, screening tests, probably familiar with these from your own life, things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, or the blood chemistry tests that you get. These give insights. They don't necessarily give any conclusions. So they highlight that there might be a risk, but they also say we need to do further testing to know for sure. And these methods are the same. So EPRI, this is an enteric pathogen risk indicator. This is a qualitative method. It is a presence-absence test based on real-time PCR. Okay, it's a screening tool for genes that are associated with, but not exclusive to, the enteric pathogens. It is not conclusive of a pathogen's presence. Okay, it can be conclusive to the extent possible of its absence, but again, remember that needle in a haystack sort of concept. Just because you test negative doesn't mean there's not something there. The method includes gene targets that are not conclusive of the pathogens. Okay, so they're based on the pathogens that we're interested in looking at, the enteric pathogens, but it's not specific for them only. And again, to emphasize this, basically it's an intentionally non-specific pathogen assay. And so the targets of the genes include the enteric pathogens and also some closely related non-pathogenic organisms. So again, a negative result, all that says is that there's no gene targets found. And a positive result means nothing more than the pathogen may be present. There is no data generated that can be definitively sourced to any pathogen, no matter how you cut and slice the data. Even go back to the raw data, it doesn't matter. You can't definitively source it to a pathogen. And the way the test is set up, the enrichments are aligned so that you can take a positive from this EPRI test and test it directly by an AOAC validated pathogen test method, if desired. Okay, so if you want to do that, if you want to know this was a pathogen truly there, you can do that. And you can also take the same samples and through culture confirmation if you want to do that. So if we look at sort of a conceptual model of, based on that, the net concept I showed earlier of where EPRI fits in, this is basically what it looks like. So I've shown the sort of hypothetical net, if you will, that EPRI would cast. And you'll note that the line here is dotted and fuzzy. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, we don't really know the full inclusivity of the method. And that's intentionally so, and we may never actually know. And I don't think that necessarily we want to know. The idea here is that it is sort of fuzzy. And of course, the target genes could, depending on what they are, move in and out of certain microorganisms over time. So that's why that line has to be sort of fuzzy. But the idea is the net is, I think, more narrow than most of the other indicator method nets would be. So just to bring it back to where I started, or where the kind of the focus of the talk, which was the positives of pathogen positives. What are the positives, the main positives of these positive results? I think there's several key main benefits. Basically, it allows you to identify the root cause and correct a problem, right? So, and the earlier you can get this positive result, the better. If you don't want it to spread beyond where it is currently, you have to find that positive, and you have to find it as soon as possible. And again, the idea is to prevent illness or outbreaks or recalls, ultimately saving lives and money. And you can do testing of product. You can look at ingredients and processes, and you can with a positive result, you can sort of start asking questions. With ingredients, which ingredient was it? Where did that come from? What supplier? Where was that supplier located in the process? Where was it in the process? Sort of what failed? And that might trigger you to do some additional environmental testing. And when you're doing environmental testing for pathogens, you can ask yourself, where did I see that positive? Was there particular equipment that was implicated, a line or a zone or facility that's impacted? You can ask the question, is my product actually at risk? And is my sanitation program working as it should, along with many other questions that a positive pathogen result will trigger and allow you to ask. And you would not be able to ask those questions or know to ask those questions if you did not have that positive pathogen result telling you that you need to look more closely at those things. So to summarize, there are a lot of good reasons, very, very good justified reasons for pathogen testing. And then there's a few bad ones too. And it's important to remember that the purpose is not to produce a constant stream of negative results, right? There's very little to no value in these negative results. Testing alone, can't say this enough, does not make anything safer. You got to focus on the value of it, not the activity. It's not just an activity, you're doing it for a reason. And even though the costs can be high, the cost of not testing in terms of lives, in terms of illness, can be much, much higher. It's easy to lose sight of that. Positive results, both pathogen and indicator, are useful, as hopefully I showed, but they're only useful if they're used, if they're acted upon. If you ignore them, if you minimize them, they do you no good. And the results are only as useful as, again, the decisions that are actions that happen because of them. And we can make more correct decisions if we do effective testing, either with pathogen or indicator methods. There are limitations to traditional indicator testing. They're quantitative, culture-based methods, and it may not be the best approach for managing risk in all circumstances. And there are now some alternative molecular risk screening methods, like EPRI, for instance, that I highlighted, that are available and can address some of these gaps. So, Scott, thanks. I do want to say thank you to my colleagues, Joel Masso and Dr. Doug Marshall, who helped contribute a lot of material for this presentation. Couldn't have pulled it together without them, and also my other EML R&D colleagues. Thank you. With that, Scott, I'll turn it back to you. Apologies for blowing through that so quickly, particularly in the beginning. Hopefully I slowed it down a little bit towards the back end there.
Oh, your pace was great. I noticed you didn't add any Mountain Dew to kind of fuel it either. So
well, actually did not get my Mountain Dew this morning. That could be, maybe that's why I was going so fast. Try to get to my Mountain Dew.
I'll pop back in here. We do have a couple questions. I had
Sure,
a couple as well. I really get excited about the EPRI. I know you do too. I was just curious a little bit. I don't, maybe others might be wondering this as well, but and you talked a lot about indicators. But how might it be used in conjunction with some of that traditional indicators or other pathogen testing? Like, how might it fit into or within a pathogen testing program? I mean, if you have to test for salmonella, what does this additional data really, do for you? Can you elaborate on that?
Hopefully it makes you feel a little bit safer. I mean, hopefully it makes you feel like you're able to manage risk more effectively because, looking just for the pathogen, because the prevalence is so low, and most of the time you're going to be getting negative results. It's not as helpful because there's not as much you can do. Of course, when you do get that positive, if you do get one, there's all those things you can do. You can ask all those questions, but if you don't, you still may be at risk. It could just be you're not seeing it. And that's where the indicator testing comes into play because it allows you to broaden the net that you're casting to look for groups of things that might indicate the potential for pathogen being there, even if you're not seeing it in your normal testing. Sometimes those indicator groups cast a little bit too wide of a net, perhaps, in some cases. So you might be getting data that's suggesting you have risk when maybe you don't actually. And that's where something like an EPRI can come into play because I think it's a slightly more narrow net that is cast. But also it allows you to take, I think that's really the value here, one of the specific values is. You can take that F3 positive and you can go, right away, you can go into a pathogen test and very quickly determine if, yes, you actually have a real problem with pathogen in that same sample that gave you sort of the F3 positive result. And you can't do that with traditional indicator testing.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of goes into line with my next question on that was like how, I mean, you talked a lot about indicator results and that type of thing. How seriously should we take indicator results? And is that really dependent on the specificity of the indicator?
Yeah,
Or,
it's so seriously is a hard question, is a hard word. I think what I see is that people are, the more narrow the net gets, the more seriously, or the higher the level of concern potentially that there is. So in that flow I showed where you had the EB and then the generic E. coli is the sort of the most narrow net, people tend to treat those generic E. coli positives more like pathogen positives. They take them very, very seriously. They get very, let's say, upset. They get very worried about them. You know, positives on the EB positive, less so. Okay, I think all the data has to be taken seriously, or it's useless, right? Why collect it if you're not going to, again, use it and take it seriously? But from an alarm perspective, I think, you know, the narrower that net gets, the more alarming perhaps that data should be. And again, one of the advantages of EPRI is that you can immediately or quickly tell if that alarm is justified or not. You know, you can take it to a pathogen test right away and say, hey, was this really a potential pathogen or a pathogen present?
okay. All right, question from the audience here, line of indicator in a way. Does environmental monitoring minimize the need for finished product testing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess if you're a production facility manager and you want to save money, yes, it should, in theory, reduce the need for finished product testing, but it really probably doesn't. Only because you just don't know. You think about a facility and you think about sampling that facility and you think about how much of it you actually can sample versus how much there actually is. So there's so many potential things that you miss. I mean, because you just can't sample it all. You can't test it all. It's the same thing with sort of product testing too. Of course, you're testing a minute portion of the overall amount of material that's produced. So in a large food production facility making tons of some particular food a day, and you test 25 grams of it, or 375 grams of 2 tons of material. That's a very, very, very small portion of that material you're actually testing. So what about all that other stuff you didn't test? You know, what's the pathogen there? And I think it's the same sort of concept with environmental testing. Yes, you need to do it, and yes, it can be helpful, but I don't think it necessarily reduces the need for product testing.
Okay, that's a great answer, and it maybe falls in line with the next question here. So maybe speaking a little bit more about contaminated products. So what balanced approaches can one consider for increasing the chance of detection if a lot is contaminated? So especially if contaminant is typically present at a very low level for a limited number of samples, right? Basically looking for providing meaningful insight for that negative result.
It's hard. I mean, it's hard. You can say test more, right? Of course, I'm going to say that, right? Working for a testing lab, I'm going to say test more. That's the way to do it. And really, ultimately, that's the answer. Either test more weight of material or test more overall number of samples. But there's statistical approaches that can be used that can kind of guide you into how many samples you should be testing based on how much material you're making and that sort of thing. But ultimately, you're never going to be able to test it all. And so you have to sort of make a call about how much you can't afford to test and how much you will test. But you can also be smart. You know, as a producer, you know your process better than anybody. And hopefully you've talked to some people that know a little bit about microbiology and food pathogens and can tell you where the areas of risk are. You know, as part of your HACCP plan, that sort of thing. You should know where some of these risky points are. And you can try and focus on those areas in your environmental testing and in product testing. I think, you know, you test as much as you can, as often as you can.
Yeah. Okay. New question. What about if the original sample came positive for a pathogen and a retest using the same sample came back negative? So it's maybe in a way like the peanut corporation situation. Maybe they weren't necessarily retesting until it came back negative, but you know, how cautious should you be about that original positive, or what might we recommend for additional testing? Or
right. So I mean, I think if you look at what FDA says a presumptive or a positive result cannot be erased by another test. It never goes away, unless there's demonstrable laboratory error. That's for sure an absolute, which almost never is the case, because there's always questions. There's always some sort of potential reason why, and additional testing is sometimes useful for informational purposes, but you have to act on that initial result, in my view, and you have to act like as if it's true, no matter what, even if you have good evidence or a lot of evidence suggesting it's not. It's just a prudent approach. The additional information of additional testing is helpful. It can be used. It can be considered, but ultimately the decision has to be made based on that initial result, in my view. And it's the producer's responsibility, unfortunately, for them to make that decision. In the testing lab, we can guide, we can suggest, we can talk about what the pros and cons are of the various methods, what the weaknesses and strengths are. We can say why this may or may not be a correct result, but ultimately the result stands as reported and should be acted on as if it is correct every time.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Let's see. I jotted down a couple others that I was kind of curious on. Maybe some elaborate on from your last slide, I believe, when you started talking about the topic. Just to kind of maybe strengthen the topic some, but so do positive results help to establish like better controls, limits, or maybe to help ID how to better test in the future? Like what other gains can you get from getting these positives? And when we say we want to welcome them,
right. They can. The issue again is around prevalence, because positives are always going to be a very low percentage of the samples that you test, right? You're going to get, hopefully you're going to get very, very few of them. So it's difficult to use them in the way you're suggesting, to set limits or to proactively do things, but it's not impossible. And I think if you trend over time, particularly with environmental testing, for things like Listeria species testing, where you can use that data to make important changes, important process improvements, and you can do it sort of right away, almost in real time. With other pathogens, which are much lower prevalence, and with product testing, where you almost never or very rarely get hits, it's more difficult to do that sort of thing with pathogen positive results. But again, it does tell you, I mean, it's a major alarm bell that you need to go back and look at your environment, at your production, at your processes, at your suppliers, at your ingredients, at every aspect of your program, your food safety program, and ask the question, how did this happen? How did this pathogen get in here? And you would not ever have that opportunity with a negative result, because a negative result doesn't trigger you to do anything except maybe say, wow, great, I'm happy, be happy and say, shoot, I dodged a bullet or whatever. It doesn't help you in any way to make a decision to improve things.
So like kind of looping back around to EPRI or indicator testing, is that sort of like another benefit? You get all that, you get a little bit more data, I suppose, and you can kind of make those informed decisions. I believe you kind of mentioned that a little bit too.
You're right. You have that. You have results, because you're going to have counts for these things, because they're going to be there, and you can look at outliers, situations. I mean, you can look at over time what happens in these counts, and you can kind of figure out what the status quo is when things are good, and then you can say, well, this is way outside the status quo. That means potentially things could be bad. Okay? And with a traditional indicator test, there's not, at that point, okay, you're not really sure. With something like EPRI, you can also take that outlier result and say, was there really a pathogen there? And you can find that out very, very quickly, which can be very, very useful, actually.
Okay. Great. Okay. Let's see. Coming through on the questions here. A couple more that came in. Some general questions about effective sampling. So this one here: what is an ideal sample size for effective sampling?
Yeah, good question. Again, there's ideal, there's ideal, and then there's what's practical, and there's also what's sort of acceptable and what's done, and it really varies by industry and by product type and category. I mean, historically, you look at product testing, 25 grams, for whatever reason. There's lots of reasons for this, actually, historical reasons, not really based on necessarily science, for 25 grams as the standard sample size. But of course, now you see 375 grams is more normal. 125 grams, composite sampling, those sorts of things. You also see 1.5 kilograms even now in produce. So there, sample sizes continue to go up. And again, the reason is, or sample weights continue to go up. The reason is sensitivity and that low prevalence, and wanting to find that low, low concentration of organisms. So I can't say there's an ideal, other than to say, in general sense, more is better. However, that cuts at some of the practicalities, from the testing lab perspective. Testing a 1.5 kilogram sample is very, very difficult in a testing lab. Think about how much actually that is of lettuce, for instance, 1.5 kilograms of lettuce. Now, let's say you have to dilute that in an enrichment media, like 1 to 10, say, even though it wouldn't be that, but let's say it's 1 to 10. That is it's just not practical to even fit a single sample into an incubator, so it's like those sorts of practicalities have to come into play as well.
Okay. Let's take one more here. Let's see. Just in general regarding indicator testing, you talked about a few options. Maybe the question is more of a, how you might apply those into your process. So the question was, which testing method is preferable for indicator testing? And
which is preferable.
Which might you choose? Is
right,
EPRI appropriate for all industries? Is it, might you cast that wide net or the narrow net?
Such a difficult question. I wish I could give you a single answer, but there really isn't a single answer. It really depends on your objective in testing, and it sort of depends on your historical process control. I mean, has your process been in control really, very well? Have you had very few or almost no pathogen hits or even previous indicator hits? Are you in an industry that's very low risk, or are you in a more high risk industry where the potential for microorganisms and pathogens to be present and to proliferate is higher? Because depending on which industry you're in or which product type you might be testing, that's going to dictate to a large extent what sort of indicator testing you might want to do, both environmental and for product as well.
Okay, so you're saying that you might shift between them. If you start seeing a lot of low results, maybe you start casting that wider net to see and expand and strengthen.
Possibly, you can do that. You can take that approach where you try to change midstream, but really it's more based on your industry and your process and the risk level associated with it.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, well, I think it's a good time to wrap it up then, and see any more to really get into right now, and we'll kind of address any additional questions that come along afterwards. Thanks, Dan. This is
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
informative as always. Yeah.
Very much appreciate the time.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I hope to see you. Hope to see you next time.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.